because of that, the California congressional delegation blocked federal ratification of those treaties. At the same time, the land that the natives were on were made public. And in the California legislature, an act called the Act for the Government, a piece of legislation called the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians was passed, basically legalizing the enslavement and then subsequently the murder of homeless natives. Number one, natives accepted a new home. Natives went to the place where that home was supposed to be, only to realize that it was not legally theirs. Natives were then subject to a law that allowed them as homeless people to be enslaved and the recipients of a brutal genocide. And that's California's history. So when we meet folks like Sammy, Ade is married to a California Pomo native. When we meet folks like Ade and really begin to learn about the history of California, it's important to realize that there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Native people in California, and their history stretches back tens of thousands of years, well prior to 1849, well prior to the missions. And so, with that, I would love to open it to Ade to say a few words before I start launching into my interrogation questions.
Thank you, Sanjay. Well, I really appreciate the recap of the history because um, in Indigenous communities, we always start off with like good words and good prayers and good thoughts, but we do so with the understanding that we are all products of this very tragic history. And so when we say our prayers and when we say our good words, it's always about remembering all the adversity and the tragedy that has hit our communities, but at the same time, like that we have overcome. And so I welcome everybody to this space. Um, we are all dealing with numerous different challenges, whether in our personal life or in our local communities or in our national community. And I really just want to thank you for coming and spending a few minutes with us, if not an hour, to really delve into some of the issues that we touch on Gather and to hear story, to talk history, to talk about challenges, and to talk about solutions and the beauty of Indigenous food systems. So thank you and welcome. And I look forward to hearing some of your comments and questions. And thank you, Sanjay.
Great, thanks today. So I have a question for you. You know, we in Gather, even though we don't make it explicit, there's an understanding amongst Native people and Native viewers of the film of the role of Native peoples as stewards. That unlike the American economy, which is completely extractive, there is a symbiosis, there's a relationship, there's a restorative element. At the same time, since most of us live in cities far away from tribal communities, can you give us a sense of how important those local tribal environmental issues are in the greater scheme of things?
Dang, Sanjay, that was like here's the heavy hammer out the gate. And first, I think the perfect way to answer this question is like when we think about like wherever you may be, like you may be in a city, you may be in a county, or you may be in a community. All of these places have names. And when Sanjay introduced Sammy, for example, um, Sammy is of the people of the Klamath River. He's of the people of Requa. And when we think about that framework, Sammy is named for the land that he comes from. The land has named him. But when we think about like Western thought and how Western frameworks start, it's always about like the explorer or somebody coming to name the land. When in indigenous communities, the land names us, and that I think is the point of divergence about how we think and view some of the most critical land based or agricultural based problems that we see today is that somehow these events and these catastrophes and these problems are outside of us as people. When in indigenous community, it we embody these problems, right? Like even if they're not our causing, when the river is sick, we're sick. When our corn is not growing, we are not growing. And so when we think about how indigenous people view the world, it's really about, and it's not just us, right? It's society. I think in Sanjay's introduction of Sameh, he talked about the world renewal, right? Like we do these things and we have these frames of thought, not just for our people, but for all people. When the Klamath River doesn't have fish, it affects the whole ecosystem. It affects all of California. And you know what? California is one of the most fertile places in all of the world. Like it's going to affect the world. And so when we think about indigenous approaches to environmental issues, it's not just about us. Even though we're named for the lands where these problems are happening, it's for the benefit of all of society and all of the world. Like there is a process and there is like a harmony to how the world functions. And it's not that indigenous people have more wisdom. It's not that we have like, well, actually, we probably do because we have like years and years and years of experience prior to contact. And it's like um, we just have like a lot more work put into what we're seeing, and the systems that we're witnessing fail right now. And so what indigenous people are really embedded in is and you know, society calls it stake, I guess, but it's a lot more than that. It's like part of our being.
Thank you, Ade. That was a actually a wonderful setup for my question for Sammy. You know, Sammy, we finished filming Gather with you in around 2018, 2019. A lot has happened up in Requa in the past month or so. Can you give us all an update about the campaign and what it means right now for your people and what it's going to mean in the next few years?
Yeah, I got this 100-pound puppy trying to get in the room right here. But one thing that's happened is in the last month that I'm excited about is we finally have struck a final deal to remove 4 dams on the Klamath River, and this will be the largest dam removal in the history of the world. And the reason why this is happening is because generations of indigenous people and activists and people from around the world came together to disrupt this dams from continuing to pollute our river and stop our way of life. And I'm so thankful to be able to serve on the Yurok Tribes Natural Resources Committee during the time where we are seeing these dams come down, to be able to grow up in a system where I'll always say, I was born in the struggle and raised in the resistance, to see my whole life since I was about 14 years old dedicated to dam removal. It's still hard for me to come to words to explain about how powerful it is. So I'm just so excited to be here and to be a part of the process and to have a common goal of providing food for people with so many people that are around California.
Thank you, Sammy. Thank you for that update and congratulations. I know a lot of work is ahead of you, so carry on. Ade, obviously the topic of the moment still remains, COVID-19. And at First Nations Development Institute, you guys have really gotten into the weeds in terms of supply chain. As folks who heard our little introduction know, Native communities were literally pushed as far away from urban centers and the spokes of the supply chains, like the transportation systems, as possible. And being less economically healthy than places like Beverly Hills, there isn't an economic incentive for grocery stores to deliver high quality, affordable food to Native communities. And of course, that's been exacerbated 1,000 times over by the supply chain disruptions of COVID-19. How has that affected your work in the short term? And is there any hope that you see for the long term?
Well, that's a very good question because I think it sits on the idea that our American food system, and if not our entire Western food system, is based on retail outlets selling food. And when we, and I really appreciate Quessa's introduction because I've been to the Mission Farmers Market. I've been to farmers markets, and that is a essential part of our food system, if not like a radical departure from our food system. Because when we think about the retail food system that we are all accustomed to, that America like totally buys into, it it's almost like a fog, right? Like we think of food and we think of going to the grocery store. We think of food and we going and purchasing it from somebody. But when we think about indigenous people and Sammy and the dam removals, like our food was our land, our food was our rivers, our food are our trees. And so when we think about how carelessly we've ignored some of those most precious resources, COVID-19 has like put the spotlight on those things because indigenous communities are, like you said, often so far from the supply chain that we have to drive 50 to 100 miles in order to get to the nearest store at times. And so when we think about COVID-19 and all the system failures, everybody like couldn't buy toilet paper, and imagine an indigenous person trying to get to the nearest store to buy toilet paper that was probably already out. Like we had to rethink like how we exist in the world. And part of that is renewing these relationships with food sources that are not in retail food chains. And the danger with that, right, particularly in California, is that, there's a gentrification of food. Yes, indigenous people have food outside of the retail food chain, but that is not for sale, right? Like we don't want our foods taken and put into the retail food chain so that they can be sold at a premium in some of like the premier organic or boutique food stores. And so when we think about COVID-19, it's forced indigenous communities to really think about what kind of food system we want to participate in and grow, but also like how we communicate that to other folks outside of our communities. And so I think for me, COVID-19, as much tragedy and as much heartache it's brought to all of our communities, there's an opportunity here to really rethink what kind of food system we participate in.
Thanks, Ade. So a quick follow-up for you before I jump to Sammy. Somebody asked in the questions about the connections between tribes when it comes to producing native foods, sharing of knowledge, sharing of products. I mean, of course, you've written extensively on the linear relationship that tribes have with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, how tribes don't have access to the same sort of grants and loan programs that food producers get off Indian country through the USDA. Land issues are of paramount importance because of the relationship that natives have, not as owners of their own land, but as trustees or wards of the state. So when you see tribes beginning to work together, what does that look like, either from an economic standpoint or from a sovereignty standpoint?
That's a heavy question, and I hesitate to always answer that kind of question. One, because to me, like the most obvious is like, what does that look like? Is like it's not a capitalist food system, right? People, the indigenous communities who are probably on the lower scale of any economic scale or any poverty scale are probably on the lower end, but that says nothing for like the character, that says nothing for who we are, that says nothing about how we think of ourselves, right? That's a scale that's developed by the Western world. And so when we think about the systems we create for ourselves and with each other, they're always going to be outside of that system. So that means like being outside of the capitalist system. And of course, that invites a lot of criticism and judgment about like not participating in the capitalist system. But also, like, I hope it invites analysis of the capitalist food system that we all participate in. Is that, you know, if people can only access really good food when you have higher incomes, like something is wrong. When people can only access like gourmet foods or foods that are good for you because you have a higher income, something is wrong. And so when Indigenous people get together with other Indigenous people outside of any government or capitalist influence, we're going to create systems that are more beneficial to the people we serve, which may or may not have money. And so, like, I think about Yurok and Sammy, and I'm sure he can probably comment after me, is that, you know, when you go to some of these dances or you go to some of these communities that are so far out that they like don't have a road to actually get to a store, you have to like send them groceries over the line, over the river, like they are fed well. They are fed some of the most like awesome salmon like you can ever get anywhere. You can't pay for that. And so when we think about the kind of systems that Indigenous people have created with each other and for each other, it's going to be like not only beautiful, but like we are eating really good and it doesn't require any money to do so. And so, of course, that complicates how like resources are allocated in America because everything is commodified. But I think to me, one of the most precious parts of being Indigenous is that I can participate in this food system that is not predicated on how much money I make.
Awesome. Sammy, a two-part question. Number one, when we first met in 2017 and you were just starting the Ancestral Guard, you were literally trying to reestablish foodways that existed pre-contact with all the North Coast tribes that regularly shared knowledge, genetics, systems, foodways, culture, spirituality. And now the second aspect is, you know, with COVID, you've literally had to do something now that Yuroks have never really done. Like you've become a farmer. How have these processes gone together? How have you indigenized or made farming Yurok? What have you been up to in that realm as well? Oh, you're on mute, Sammy.
Sorry about that, Sanjay. I'm always excited to be on panels with Sanjay and because I learned so much and it's always such a good time. But one thing that when we first started, the main thing it was our trip to Brazil, and just to see these indigenous people over there, I had no idea how we were going to help these people, why they even wanted us to come see us or wanted us to come see them. And you know, I was really scared about that. But the question was, how are we still alive after 100 years of a dam being put on our river? Because they see the effects and it's killing them, even though the turbines haven't been turned on yet. And that question alone, it's like you realize the struggle and when you're trying to figure out how to eat and when you're trying to figure out these things and how we've adapted to our way of life and how we've always made it work for our families, and we've normalized being in these scenarios. We've normalized being outlawed and, you know, not being able to access foodways that our ancestors, you know, had access to, and risking everything to be able to access these things and doing, you know, the same things our grandparents did, and knowing that they ran into the same troubles that we're running into today. So this system that's at play isn't just affecting us in California, but it's affecting indigenous people throughout the world. And as we began to travel and meet with more and more indigenous people from all over the place, we realized one thing is there's indigenous people, no matter where they are, they're stepping up and they're making sure that their way of life is continuing and that their kids understand, language or stories or, mentalities that carry on who they are. And number two is their food systems have been oppressed to the point where they no longer have access to these things that their people have depended on for thousands of years. And so when this coronavirus hit, it was crazy time for us because we've been pushing food sovereignty initiatives for a couple of years and developing this program, but we just couldn't really gain traction. Um, but once we did start gaining traction, thankfully for the people, First Nations and a day who believed in what we were doing, and Sanjay and everybody believed in what we're doing, it gave us the opportunity to actually plant these gardens. And by the time, everything hit, we already were having plants in the ground, we had gardens in, and other people and leaders in our community were coming to us for help and seeing how they can also start gardens. And even the director of our emergency services came down to our garden that we started because she said these are the type of services that we need to start investing in for people. And so right now we're even teamed up with UC Davis to train tribal members. And Belle Chavez, she used to be a data collector for fisheries, but the fishery season's died down, and now what she's going to be doing is help us collect data for food sovereignty initiatives and actually putting strength behind the practices that we implement in our communities and giving us an opportunity to grow. So I'm really excited about the future and what it holds and where we're at.
I mean, can you give us an update as well on the community gardens you started and what it's been like kind of expanding your feeding programs, your hunting and fishing programs for youth, taking them up the river during this period?
Yeah, so for us, what we're doing is over this next year, the Ancestral Guard is going to be fully devoted to food sovereignty initiatives and providing these healthy opportunities for our community. And a lot of the ways where we did that is we are fishermen and we started these gardens. And when we first started, my younger brother Peter told me, don't do it because we've never grown a garden. We don't know what to do. And a lot of people told us that. And they're like, you guys aren't gardeners, you're fishermen, stick to what you know. But I knew that's what had to happen. And the reason why is because it's what these kids wanted, these indigenous youth. That's like when we were originally going down the river talking about when I was first teaching all these young, which are now grown adults, leaders in our community. But when they were young kids, all of our programming is based off what I've written down in that boat on a piece of scrap paper with a Sharpie when we were fishing that day, and I've applied all my skills throughout learning about community organizing and programming and through the Undam the Klamath movement into developing these programs for years before we even actually had the money or opportunity to share them with the world. And, this programming that we were running around with, now that we've actually be able to show it to the world, now we're opening up doors. Originally UC Berkeley stepped up and they told us, you guys really want to learn about foodways, you have to look at it through a different light. And so they picked up our programming the very beginning and kind of helped us navigate on how to do research. And so from there, we started looking at, all right, in Northern California, where we're from, community gardens are not helping our people how they should. And this was an idea that sparked a lot of debate, and a lot of people didn't agree. But community gardens in other places and urban areas, they may thrive and do good. But in rural California, when people live so far away, and there's no way people can dedicate time to the community garden when they're trying to keep a house over their head and all this stuff, it all piles up to where our community gardens wind up on the shoulders of 1 to 2 people. The resources never get to where they're going, and people get fatigued and they don't want to do it anymore. And we're constantly cycling through these people. Well, we took this data, and we started to apply tradition methods. And we developed the Victorious Gardens Initiative. And we also have a programming where we're going to be building 60 garden boxes in January. Altogether, we'll have 60 garden boxes and for 60 families within the 5th district of Delaware County. And we're going to help families operate these by filling them with soil, filling them with the organic plant starts, and doing an assisted gardening service once a week where we come by, we check in and make sure everything's doing good. And we're doing this so we can teach our people about the mentality of raising food in your house. Because when we're doing our initial research, we realized a lot of these families that had gardens, they had it when their children or their grandparents had gardens. Then there's this whole generation of people who didn't have gardens in their life, and they do have a deeper dependency on this systematic oppression, which has been, generated by not only colonization but the capitalist system from our food waste. So we're literally buying into our own sickness, and being able to provide an opportunity for families who are already strong and capable, giving them the opportunity to grow food and giving them the insurance that we're going to be there to help make sure that their crops come out is revolutionary in our time and our place, because it's never been done before. And now we have a bunch of eyes on us, and we are excited to be able to have this, relationship with UC Davis to combine this modern science with these traditional values and ways of taking care of our people, and be able to share it with the communities around us. And we got to thank First Nations Development Institute and Vesper Society, who believed in us, right out of San Francisco too. So it's pretty awesome.
Thank you, Sammy. Always, always super inspiring. Ade, a common question that people have, and maybe we can just focus on California, is how can people help? Like, do they go to Sacramento with signs? Do they send donations to First Nations, to Ancestral Guard? What are a few ways that people can
Well, of course, the Ancestral Guard, they're doing good work, could always use funds. I run a California Tribal Fund that serves most of the nations in California. But really, I think what will go a really long way is if people start challenging the narrative that we hear about the history of not only America, but of California. My daughter is in 4th grade. She still, as a native Californian person, she still had to build the mission, and it was it was so disturbing, not only to me, but to my daughter, because we know that's not functional. That's not the real story. The mission system was very damaging to Indigenous people, but at the same time, that's still absent from a lot of the curriculum we hear in California. And so how do you change the story we tell about the founding of California? One, we could do it by law, but two, also is the general public could start telling the real story to their children. And part of that comes from learning about the real story about where you are. California has some of the most tragic history in this country, no matter what county you come from. We see counties named after Indigenous slaveholders, and leaders of militias that actually went and counted bounties on Indian heads. The story of California is so ripe for telling, but nobody is telling it but Indigenous people. And unfortunately, we live in a country where Indigenous voices are not only ignored, but they're not valued at the status that they need to be valued at. And so we're really relying on allies and the general public to recite the real stories of our state and of our country. And so I think how can people help is learn about the Indigenous people in your county and in your community. Figure out what happened to them. Are they still there? There's so many Indigenous communities that are no longer in existence because they were literally genocided. I don't even know if that's a verb, but that's what happened. And the ones that remained either indoctrinated them or adopted those folks. or the ones that remain, like figured out ways to actually circum that genocide period. And that is something that's never told in any recitation of California history. So we really need people to learn about that history, but also to retell it, because the if the the California education system is not going to tell it, then the general public needs to tell it. And hopefully through that avenue, we can have changes in how we talk about the history of this state.
Thank you, Ade. Sammy, I know that you guys are up in the far corner of California, good 7 hours up the 101 to get to the Glen. But what can folks do digitally, virtually, to be of assistance to the Ancestral Guard and to the work you're doing on the Yurok Nation?
Yeah, one thing is to, like Ade said, learn the history. And one of the histories that I'd, like to challenge everybody to teach their family about is the history of dams on the Klamath River and dam removal, and look at the process. With a quick Google, you can quickly Google Ancestral Guard or quickly Google Undam the Klamath, and these stories will pop up of the people, because it's nothing new. What I'm doing today and what we're all doing today, this has always been happening within our generations. My great grandmother was fighting for healthcare of indigenous people in California when it was hard enough being a woman. She used to tell me stories all the time, and that's what she used to tell me. And my grandmother Elma on my father's side fought for the education of indigenous people in California, and people told them that they would never get it. And today, thankfully, we have both those things. And so it was the same thing with dam removal. People told us why, even people from our own community sometimes would say, you're fighting so hard and you're dedicating so much, like, why? And sometimes I won't even have an answer for them. I just know that this is what I have to do. And, I feel the same way about growing food. I feel the same way about providing healthy opportunities for our families, because the ancestral guard, people think about as protecting the ancestors of the past, when that's not what it's about. What it's really about is protecting these future generation of ancestors as they enter the world, and making sure that they have access to healthy opportunities. And we have children in our family right now that ever since they've been on this earth, we've had gardens. I'm going to be an uncle 2 times from 2 different brothers, so this is pretty exciting. In our families, they will never know what it's like to grow up without having a garden or access to fresh vegetables, where that wasn't the case in my lifetime or my mother's lifetime. So, if you really want to help, invest in your local history, invest in indigenous youth, invest in your own youth, and make sure that all that's coming together in the same way. Because when you invest in indigenous communities, you're investing in the health and the environment, and we all need the health and the environment. And there's so much that we can learn. Like even today, right now, the main thing we're doing is we're doing a garden expansion. We're going to be doing, we did this year, we did a 100-foot rows, 100-foot rows, 3-foot beds, and we're going to be doing 2 more garden sites of 100-foot rows next year, hopefully. And we're looking for partnerships, and we're always thankful for like any help that we can get in doing that. We're also looking into starting a mushroom farm for people this year, so we can provide plant-based proteins. And that's research that we're taking upon ourselves as indigenous youth to learn this. We don't have professionals, we don't have access to that because it's not in our community. But once we go outside our community, we're developing these relationships. Even though we're being hit by COVID, we can't let that stop us from continuing to build our future and making sure that our children have strong healthy immune systems, and start at the building blocks of preventing diabetes and preventing heart disease and preventing these these stepways to addiction in people's life. All this can start with investing in this next generation and investing in food security. And that's where we're getting to. That's where we're at in the restorative revolution. And whatever that looks like to you, that's it's we're all part of the same movement.
Thank you, Sammy. People can find Sammy on Instagram at ancestral_guard. there is a host of resources at firstnations.org. I really want to thank you, Sammy and Ade, for bringing so much light and love and wisdom into this conversation. And of course, to Christine and Cindy and everyone at Kwesa. Christina, any parting words for all of us?
Hi, everybody. Cindy and I have been here in the background watching the chat and trying to answer questions, and we just really appreciate everyone being here. I think the learning to do is quite profound and quite humbling, and it's also really inspiring because the solutions are out there. So it's not just how do I fix things, but it's more like how do I start paying attention to and listen to the people who are doing the work, know what's involved, and just sort of demanding that they have a seat at the table. And I think this always, all of these conversations to me come back to who has the power and why, and who has the solutions, and they're often not, in the same seat. And so how do we start changing that collectively? Because we know that our existing system is killing us, and it's painful to see. And in this moment of COVID, where we're all in different spaces, I just so appreciate everybody making time in their evening to join, to hear the conversation, to meet 3 people who are passionately doing this work. Sanjay, you didn't talk at all about why you chose to do this film. But I do think if we end on one thing, it would be good to hear from you about your work in this and why you chose this as a topic. And then for everyone to, yes, continue the conversations. There's a lot of questions about what to do and how to keep it going. And I just want to put that back on everyone. The resources are out there and the conversations are there to be had. And you made a first step by joining tonight. And hopefully Kwesa can continue the conversations. And there will be there are many other groups doing this work. So I think Kwesa really hopes to start shining the light more on existing communities that have been having these conversations for a long time now. But before we close, Sanjay, can you tell us a little bit more about what drew you to this story and why you worked on this film?
But to be honest, I had no place in this space. I was really humbled and honored to really have the permission of folks like Ade, her grandmother, to whom the movie's dedicated, Sammy, his community, Elsie and their community. Even though my father and also my spiritual teacher both grew up in British-controlled India, and that sense of being an occupied people is just a generation away. I could never have attempted to fathom the kind of original grounds for extractive colonialism, Turtle Island. At the same time, just from afar, it's very apparent that, as Sammy mentioned, Native people are still here. And you can see how corporate tactics, government tactics have all inevitably and ultimately failed in assimilating / subjugating Native peoples of Turtle Island. And they've been models, for people all around the world trying to resist the loss of their culture and their spirituality. And as much as we were able to portray a glimmer of that in Gather, it's all the good things in the movie are because of our characters, all the mistakes are because of me. But at the same time, there's 574 federally recognized tribes and hundreds of more that don't have that political little distinction. There's thousands of stories out there. There's, as stellar as Sammy is, there's probably at least 2 more Sammys, maybe 3 more Sammys in North America. And we just hope that this film highlights the incredible work that local Native communities are doing all over Turtle Island and inspires people who are not from those communities to help in meaningful ways or stay out of the way in meaningfully constructive ways as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all for joining us tonight and for just being a part of the conversation. I'm watching everyone pipe in about Sogorea Land Trust and how great they are. So there's no shortage of information out there. Sammy, thanks for dialing in and joining us. I know you guys have been speaking to so many groups, so thank you for making time for us tonight. I wish we could get a shot of your beautiful puppy, your 200-pound puppy in there somewhere. a day. Next time you're at Mission Community Market, let us know so we can come say hi and wave to you and eventually give hugs. And everyone who knows Quezon knows Cindy Mendoza.
Thank you everyone for joining us. It's been a pleasure to have this conversation. We love the stories, and we know, again, there's lots of this great work happening out here, and just making room for this, for the Native peoples to teach us what we need to learn. So thank you.
All right, take care, everyone. Have a great night. Be safe.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.